Finis Bonum. Sarah walked next to her grandfather as the old man carefully worked his way toward the gravesite beneath an elm tree near the center of the cemetery. They reached the headstone and began a silent routine that had evolved earlier in the summer when Sarah volunteered to bring him for his weekly visits to his wife's grave after he had flunked the eye test for his driver's license. The old man took a small white stone from his pocket, placed it on the headstone, and then tended flower pots while Sarah cut grass from around the base of the marker. When they were done, they stood silently by the grave until the old man put the white stone back in his pocket, signaling it was time to go. They walked past Sarah's car on the gravel lane at the perimeter of the cemetery, and then up a gently rising lawn toward an old country church that watched over its sleeping parishioners in the background, where they sat down on a weathered bench near the side of the building and began a light conversation. They talked for a few minutes, and then during a pause in the conversation, Sarah looked out at the ripening corn in the field behind the churchyard. Harvest time was near, and soon the chill of fall would arrive. Their special time together on the bench was coming to an end. She turned toward her grandfather as he looked toward the cemetery. It was time to ask the question that had been on her mind since early summer. "Grandpa, can I ask you something personal?" "Well, I suppose so, yes," he said as he turned to meet her eyes. "Would you tell me the story of your white stone?" "Well, there's not much to tell. It's just an old good luck charm I've had for many years." Sarah smiled. "When I was a little girl, I saw it on your nightstand and asked that same question. You gave the same answer, and when I kept asking why it was so lucky, you promised you'd tell me when I got older, remember?" "Well, now Grandpa, I'll be 42 next month. Don't you think I'm about old enough?" "Sarah, it's awful personal. I've never told anyone, not even your mother. One reason it's special to me is because only your grandma and I know about it. But you promised to tell me." "Little kids don't forget promises, do they?" He pinched her cheek and smiled. "But it's a story that goes back almost 90 years. Do you sure you want to hear it?" Sarah nodded. "All right, then," he said. "I've always had the stone with me, since as far back as I can remember. When I was in my teens, I carried it mostly out of habit and couldn't remember why it was so special when I was a toddler. So I asked my mother about it, hoping she might know. She said she never understood my attraction to it either, but that it had a strange effect on me when I found it. She then told me a story that began at my birth. She said I was born with my right arm held tight to my chest and my right hand in a fist. When I wouldn't move my arm by the time I was ready to go home from the hospital, they brought in a specialist to look at me. After a long exam, he decided there wasn't any physical cause for the problem, so he told my parents it must be a faulty nerve from the brain and that it should get better as I got older. They took me home and my mother quit work to raise me, even though they were poor and needed the money. By the time I was 2, I used my right hand for eating and play, but held my arm to my chest the rest of the time. My parents were still concerned, but they didn't say anything, I suppose because they were afraid that drawing attention to my habit might interfere with the progress they saw. Then one day when I was about 2 years old, my mother was hanging laundry out to dry while I played in the backyard, and I wandered into the flower garden. She saw me poking at a caterpillar on a tulip leaf and then watched as I reached with my right hand to pick up something from the dirt. It was the white stone. She said she kept an eye on me because she was afraid I'd put the stone in my mouth and swallow it. I must have been fascinated by its shape because I turned it over and over in my hand for quite a while. Finally I walked over to her, held it up, and said, "Tome." The old man stopped talking to look up. Dark clouds were rolling in from the west, and the wind had picked up. "It looks like rain. Maybe we should start back." "Not yet, Grandpa. Tell me the rest. I've waited all these years." "All right," he said as he looked up again. "Where was I?" "You showed your mother the stone." "Yes, I held it up and said, 'Tome.' Well, I only knew a few words at the time, and she was pleased I'd found something that brought a new word. But she tried to take it away, still worried I might put it in my mouth. I wouldn't let go, so she watched me play for a while, and when I didn't put it in my mouth, she let me keep it, figuring I'd eventually lose interest and drop it in the grass. I still held the stone when my father came home for supper, so she told him about it, and said she'd noticed that since I started carrying it around, I didn't hold my hand to my chest. He was curious, so he took the stone away from me to see what my reaction was. When he pried it away, I put my hand to my chest and had a tantrum, so he gave it back. Over the next few days, they slowly coaxed me into keeping the stone in my pocket instead of holding it all the time, and finally, after a few weeks, my habit of clenching my fist was gone. From that point on until I was in my late teens, I carried that old stone in my pocket during the day and kept it under my pillow at night until it got so smooth that a big raindrop hit him squarely on his thick glasses, causing him to flinch. They both looked up and saw the rain sweeping across the fields only a few hundred yards to the west. "We better go or we'll get soaked, young lady." Sarah reluctantly nodded, and they scurried to the car as fast as the old man's stiff legs could carry him. She pulled into the entrance of her grandfather's farm and drove up the long gravel driveway toward his house. They had been quiet during the trip home, and now that the rain had stopped, it was even quieter in the car. She parked on the turnaround near the front porch, and just as they got out of the car, the sun reappeared overhead. Sarah held his arm as they climbed the steps to the front porch. "Would you like some tea before I go home?" she said. "Yes, I'd like that. Let's sit on the porch swing like old times." Sarah went into the house to make tea, and he sat in the swing, looking out at the cornfields beyond the manicured lawn that surrounded the homestead. A touch of déjà vu came over him as he smelled the lilies in his wife's garden just a few yards from the porch, and for a moment he thought he saw her standing by the corn near the road. He had quit farming and sold the land to his nephew after his wife passed away 3 years earlier, but kept the homestead and a few acres surrounding it just to be near the land in his memories, hoping to die where he had lived for nearly half of his life. And what a good half it had been with Grace. So many, "Here's your tea." Startled from a reverie he had slipped into, he blinked, thinking Sarah was his wife for a moment. "Thank you, sweetheart." They sipped their tea and rocked gently in the swing, looking at the vibrant green surrounding them. Sarah had thought about her grandfather's story of the white stone on the drive home, but there must be more to it. Why set it on the headstone every week? "Grandpa, what do you make of the stone in your bent arm? Can you remember that far back?" "No, I can't remember, and I've wondered about the arm over the years. Sometimes when I hold the stone at night when it's quiet, I can almost feel something." "Something?" "I don't know. A place? Something about your grandma and me. It's hard to describe." "You said you put it away when you were a teenager. What made you take it out and carry it around again?" "That's the strangest part of the story. I don't know if you'll believe me if I tell you. Sometimes when I think about it, I hardly believe it myself." "You've never lied to me, Grandpa." He smiled. "No, I've never lied to you." The old man paused a moment as he opened a door to the past in his mind and focused his thoughts. "Did your mother ever tell you that I was a preacher before you were born?" "Yes, I think she mentioned it a few times when I was young. I never could picture you as a minister, so I guess I never thought about it much." "Well, I don't think about it much either. It's hard for me to—" He looked at the fields in the distance and grimaced. His left arm had been sore all afternoon, and now a sharp pain in his shoulder muscle caused him to tense up. "You okay, Grandpa?" "Yes, where was I?" "You were a preacher." "Yes, it has to do with your grandma. Let me go back a little further. We lived in St. Louis when I was a boy, and right after high school I decided to become a minister, I suppose because my grandfather was one. I remember going to church when I was a little boy and listening to him. He made quite an impression on me. I even went to the same seminary he did. After graduation, I interned at a small church in Lincoln, Nebraska, and one Sunday when I was giving a sermon, my eyes caught sight of a pretty young woman with straight hair sitting in the pews. It was your grandma. I tried not to look at any one person in the pews as I talked, like they taught us in seminary, but I couldn't help myself. Grace had this little odd cowlick in her hair, and, well, anyway, after the service, one of the parishioners introduced her to me. She was a relative visiting from right here in Iowa and was about my age. It was love at first sight, and before my internship was over, we got engaged. As luck would have it, I found my first church parish back in my hometown, and when I was settled and had enough money, I brought her to St. Louis and we got married. That's sweet, Grandpa, so romantic. Well, I wasn't so sweet back then. Anyway, I got to be a pretty good preacher, nearly as good as my grandfather. I used to think it would have been nice if he were alive to see me back then, but he died when I was only 5. The congregation started to grow and I stayed there, and after a few years we outgrew the old church and built a new one. Life seemed pretty good during those years. About the time your mother went off to college, your grandma and I were still as much in love as the day we met, and those church folks were like family to me. I was pretty serious about religion back then, too serious, I suppose, and I didn't laugh much. Hell, I thought I had God and life all figured out. Your grandma used to tease me once in a while, but I didn't know any better at the time. How she put up with... Anyway, one Sunday after church, I was reading in the den when I heard the crash of dishes in the kitchen. I ran in and found Grace on the floor unconscious, bleeding from the nose, so I rushed her to the hospital. When we got there, she was almost dead, but somehow they managed to save her. They took x-rays later that afternoon and found a growth on the brain. They said they had to operate right away. It was awful. I kissed her and watched her as they wheeled her into surgery, and when she went through those swinging doors, I didn't know if I'd ever see her alive again. After what seemed like an eternity, the doctors came out with long faces and told me the worst. Grace had an inoperable brain tumor and would die in a few months. Sarah's jaw dropped slightly and she leaned forward as he continued. I don't remember much of what they said that day, but I do remember someone saying she should go to a sanitarium so they could make her comfortable those last few months. When she woke up from surgery, we talked and cried some, and when she said she wanted to die in familiar surroundings, I brought her home and put her in her bed. Sarah looked perplexed. But Grandpa, Mom never told me anything about Grandma being that sick. Didn't you tell her? Well, I called her at college and told her Grandma was sick, but she never knew how bad it was. She came home for a few days to visit, but for some reason I just couldn't tell her the truth. I suppose because I couldn't believe it myself. Good thing, too. I saved her all that. But wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. Where was I? You took her home to die. Yes, I took her home. All of a sudden, being a minister didn't seem so important, so I took a leave of absence from the church and I started a vigil. I stayed at her side night and day, hardly left the room, and that's when it hit me. I'd neglected her way too much all those years when I was trying to save souls. I just couldn't accept what God had done to Grace, so I began praying over her day and night. And when I woke in the middle of the night when she moaned or coughed, I prayed some more. Days turned into weeks, and she got thinner and paler and finally slipped into a coma. God wasn't listening. It was the most unbearable agony I've ever felt in my life. Even toward the end, I couldn't let her go, so I prayed harder and harder until I was almost delirious. Then one night, in the middle of a fervent prayer over her frail little body, I just sat up and quit babbling and put my Bible down in exhaustion. My faith was gone and Grace was going away, and I sobbed like a baby. Life was empty. I cried for what seemed like an eternity, and then finally even my tears were gone. I sat there in silent resignation, cursing the God I'd created in my mind all those years. He didn't exist anymore, never did, and somehow I felt relieved. I was sitting there without a thought in my head, like I was in outer space. It's the only time in my life I've ever felt I was in a void, like I didn't exist. And suddenly I heard a voice, not in my head, but an audible voice in the room. "The stone," it said. What was that, I wondered. The voice repeated the word several times. I dug deep into my mind, searching for a stone, and finally it sank in and I understood. The tome, of course. What had I done with it? I went to my jewelry box in the dresser and dug through it. I'd put it there when I was in seminary and forgotten it, along with all my other childhood memories. I found it in a small envelope and took it out and rolled it in my right hand. It was warm and smooth, and somehow made me feel better, like it made me feel when I was a boy. Don't ask me why, but for some reason I walked to the bed and placed it on Grace's shaven head, right over the spot where they'd found the tumor, cupping it over the stitches in the palm of my hand. Hours went by and I fell asleep. I remember I dreamed about a garden. It was a beautiful place, and I still dream that same dream sometimes. When I woke up, it was morning, and the old man started to choke up. "Come on, Grandpa, you can say it." His eyes were misty. I looked at Grace, and she was staring at me. Her green eyes were sparkling, and her color was back. His voice steadied. I thought I was still dreaming. I blinked and shook my head, and then I looked again. She smiled and reached out, and we hugged and kissed like I never, and I laughed like I never, and, well, it's a day I'll never forget. His eyes glassed over as he took a sip of tea. "Why, Grandpa, it's a miracle. She took a sip of tea, his words still sinking in. They both put their cups down. "So then what happened?" she said. "Well, a few days after that, I took all my books, packed them up, and sent them to the old seminary I graduated from. Then I called in my resignation to the head deacon at the church and threw my robes and my black suits and my cleric collars, my old Bible that belonged to my grandfather, and anything else that reminded me of religion into the trash. It was a hell of a pile, it was," he chuckled. "About a month after that, Grandma was pretty much back to her old self, and her hair came back. It was the damnedest thing you ever saw. That colic of hair she had all those years was gone. We laughed about that one a long time. At least something good had come out of her ordeal. The rest of the story you probably know. About a year later, we moved here to Waverly to take over the farm after your grandma's folks died. Your mom came here after college and met your dad, and here we are. And here we are." Sarah stood up and kissed her grandfather on the cheek. "Thanks, Grandpa. You'll never know how much it means to me. I won't tell a soul about this, I promise." "Well, that's okay. It really doesn't matter anymore, sweetheart. The story's about over." Sarah took the teacups into the house as the old man rocked gently in the swing. He waved to someone near the cornfield, put his hands on his lap, and then slumped his head. The story was over. A few days later, the old man watched from a distance as an overflow crowd came to his reviewal and funeral at the old country church where his wife was buried. Just before the casket was closed, his granddaughter kissed him one last time, and then placed a small object under his hands next to his chest when no one was looking. After the service, he stood silently by the elm as they lowered his remains into the ground, and then watched as the crowd dispersed. Sarah was the last to leave, and when the dust from her receding car settled back onto the road, he smelt the aroma of fresh-cut lilies, and he knew it was time to go. A gentle hand touched him on the shoulder, and when Stephen Tanner IV turned around to see what was behind him, he finally joined the congregation. As he looked upward from the glowing hand on his shoulder to view the mysterious Creator whom he had struggled so hard to understand in his earlier years, his eyes grew wide. Much to the old Reverend's surprise, his Maker had a familiar face, and his name was Philip.